An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
Good day, friends. Welcome back to the Life After God podcast. My name is Ryan Bell, and I'm your host. This is episode 85. My guest today is Christopher Cameron. I recently came across Chris's new book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, and I knew I had to try to have him on the podcast. I'm so grateful that he agreed to speak with me. If you haven't heard about Chris Cameron, you will be in the coming months and years, I'm sure. His voice is a part of a growing chorus of voices that are lifting up the historic contributions of black freethinkers in America. As is so often the case when history is written and told, the thoughts and works of white people are noted. Thomas Paine, Robert Ingersoll, Charles Darwin, Carl Sagan, Richard Dawkins, and so forth. I'm sure you've heard a lot about these individuals and their contributions to free thought and scientific discovery. You might occasionally hear about Frederick Douglass, but do you know the story of Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Langston Hughes, Nella Larson, Richard Wright, Elizabeth Hendrickson, Grace Campbell, or Ella Baker, to name a few? Dr. Cameron's book is an exciting, fast-paced read through history, some familiar ground, but with a different lens, opening new vistas for readers, especially white readers, who think they've understood post-Enlightenment American history. Dr. Christopher Cameron is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's also the founder and past president of the African American Intellectual History Society. He received his B.A. in history from Keene State College and his M.A. and Ph.D. in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and American religious and intellectual history. Cameron's first book, entitled To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Antislavery Movement, was published by Kent State University Press in 2014. His second book, and the subject of our conversation today, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, was published by Northwestern University Press in September 2019. His current book project, entitled Liberal Religion and Race in America, explores the intersection of race and liberal religion dating back to the mid-18th century and the varied ways that liberal theology has informed African American religion and politics in the 20th and 21st centuries. This podcast is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you who contribute anywhere from $1 to $100 a month to make it possible. So I want to say a heartfelt thank you to each one of you who contribute. It doesn't matter how much you contribute. The fact that you contribute to the making of this show is what matters the most. As you know, and as I've said many times before, I feel very strongly that we are all part of a conversation that is only now emerging in new ways, and that conversation is about exactly the things that Chris and I discuss in this episode and the things that he writes about in his amazing book. If you'd like to be a part of this community, making this podcast available for free to anyone who wants to listen, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. There you can make a monthly pledge of any amount you like, from $1 up to whatever you think it's worth. At the $5 per month level, you'll be invited to the private Facebook group for members of the community. I'm really looking forward to meeting you and interacting with you over there. Okay, enough about all of that. Here's my conversation with Chris Cameron. Chris, welcome to the Life After God podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Been really enjoying your new book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it, and then, talking a little bit about your personal story and kind of where all of this came from for you. I've had conversations with various different leaders and thinkers in the Black secular movement in contemporary times. And of course, these names come up, the people that you write about in the book. But it's so amazing to have it organized and, sequential and with these really interesting stories and quotes. And so first of all, just thank you for all your amazing work here on putting this together.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed the whole process.
So you're looking at, as the title says, the history of African American secularism, and you frame this with a 19th century term, Freethinkers. We still use that expression today somewhat, but it was definitely a more popular way of identifying in the late 18th, 19th centuries. And I wonder if that gives you, did you feel like that gave you freedom to explore more? Like, I feel like the term is broad enough that a lot of individuals can fall under this idea of being free thinkers without having to necessarily be atheists per se.
Yeah, exactly. I pretty much use the term the same way Susan Jacoby does in her work,
right?
Free Thinkers, and my title is obviously sort of a play on her title with the addition of Black and African American. But in Free Thinkers, Jacoby notes that the term Free Thinkers is really pretty inclusive of a wide variety of irreligious and kind of quasi-religious beliefs, ranging from atheism, agnosticism, deism, and even those who maybe believe in a God, but one that just isn't particularly involved in human life and in human affairs. So it does provide me some flexibility with sort of who I can discuss, and allows me to include sort of contested figures like Frederick Douglass, for example, right, who ranged through a number of kind of religious opinions and orientations during the course of his life, but generally speaking was always pretty skeptical of institutional Christianity and of Christian ministers. So his sort of anti-clericalism and lack of participation in Christian churches allows me to sort of place him in this category that also includes sort of very kind of hard atheists like Richard Wright in the 20th century.
Yeah, and it's definitely, and I think we face this today, and you talk about this, that people go by expressions or identities that allow them to be vocal and participate in the discourse without being so controversial that they, get pushed aside or even, much worse, harmed in some way. So, for Frederick Douglass, it's a much different context than for Richard Wright, who knows what Frederick Douglass would have thought or believed or expressed if he were, later in history, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. I suspect he probably would have, come out as an agnostic were he alive 30 or 40 years later. But, he even does say in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, that there was a point where he was an atheist or his opinions were akin to atheism. But then there were other points where he was, evangelical Christian, and just his views ranged back and forth depending on the broader context. And that's one of the things that the book shows, especially for the era of slavery, is that this context of the institution of slavery, the brutality, the assaults, the separation of families, played a really significant role in sort of the foundations of Black free thought. Right.
Yeah, and that's the first chapter, and you start with slavery and Reconstruction, and really look at how slaves responded to the white man's God, the white religion, Christianity, and how for me, it really challenged the myth or the narrative that I was raised with, that that slaves were highly religious. We have the the Negro spirituals, and there's just a sense that the early Black Americans, the slaves that were brought from Africa, were really Christian, that they really embraced Christianity, and you with a lot of evidence and detailed stories, really calling that into question and say there are many sociological reasons that might appear to be so, and that people might have gone along with some things, but that there was likely a much higher level of non-belief, or at least agnosticism, during a period of slavery. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So in making this argument, I'm building off of the work of Anthony Pinn, of course, but also historian Daniel Fountain, whose work Slavery, Civil War, and Salvation argued that less than half of enslaved people were Christians prior to the Civil War. Now, Fountain doesn't necessarily go in and discuss atheism or free thought or anything like that. But when I read his work, that's something that kind of piqued my interest and, made me kind of keep looking for instances of non-belief among the slave community. One story that I tell in particular was of an enslaved man named Austin Stewart, who he writes in his autobiography that he published in the 1850s. He was a slave. He gained his freedom, wrote a slave narrative, and he discusses one scene in particular in his life where it's a Sunday morning, and he's very careful to point out that this was a Sabbath morning, and he was on his way to church, right? And as he was going, he encountered his master, who was administering a brutal whipping to his sister. And immediately after, his master started joining him on the way to church, right? And here Stewart is, recounting this. And finally, he asks, can anyone wonder that the slaves feel there's no just God for the poor African, right? That these types of instances are the direct causes of non-belief in slave communities. Now, my book doesn't necessarily discount the religiosity of a wide swath of the slave population. Sure. Many were Christians. Many participated in sort of non-institutional versions of Christianity that Albert Rabbitoe explores in his important book, Slave Religion. Many also adhere to sort of African traditions and conjure and things like that. But what my work does do is sort of add some complexity and gives us a more fuller picture of the religious and non-religious life of slaves, and shows that while most slaves probably were religious, we have ignored an important segment of the slave population that rejected all religions.
I found it so interesting, and I guess it had escaped my attention in the past. One of the abolitionist arguments, white abolitionists, or I guess black abolitionists as well, was that slavery was harming the gospel message. Like that, basically, we were pushing slaves away from salvation through the institution of slavery, and therefore slavery should be ended as a gospel sort of initiative.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is, of course, sort of a direct response to the pro-slavery argument that the institution of slavery is an important means of Christianizing this sort of barbarous African population. So white abolitionists and black abolitionists were quick to point out that simply is not happening, right? Sure, some are being Christianized, but many more are being turned away from participation in Christianity because of what they see as the hypocrisy of their masters and the sort of growing prevalence of pro-slavery religion, especially after the 1830s.
So this is, it's another example of, colonialism and religion sort of going hand in hand. I mean, it's the one that touches on the American experience most specifically, but around the world, this was a European belief that, we could Christianize the world at the edge of a sword, so to say, or to force people into a particular way of life, a way of believing. And of course, if you're in that, if you're on the receiving end of that, it makes sense that you would, and you tell many stories of this, even in the Harlem Renaissance chapter, of people sort of nodding their head and agreeing to that because it saved their hide. They agreed to go along with this Christianization in name only to try to, survive.
Yeah, exactly. And this was really a strategy that Black abolitionists began to develop in the 1790s. And it's sort of the origins of the politics of respectability, whereby African-American leaders, and I discussed this a little bit more in my first book, To Plead Our Own Cause, which focuses on Black abolitionists. But you have leaders like Prince Hall, Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and others in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, making the case that African Americans need to be Christian, they need to display their, morality, always live upright lives, don't steal, lie, cheat, or anything. And these behaviors were seen as the basis for citizenship, right? That Black people need to show that they're worthy of American citizenship in order to be accorded the rights and benefits of citizenship, that until they could show they were good Christians, they would never be respected and would never be given equality. So, in some ways, this actually was an effective strategy for building alliances with kind of like-minded white abolitionists during this time period. But in a lot of other ways, it sort of backfired and kind of hamstrung the Black community, if you will, to Christianity.
Yeah, and I think that we still live with the legacy of that today. Where
certainly,
the politics of respectability across the board has become much too prevalent in our society. So in the next chapter, you move to talk about the Negro Renaissance, the resulting from the Great Migration North, cities like Chicago and New York. Is it fair to say that as time progressed and as sort of the world became more modern and cosmopolitan, that it just became a little safer for people to express their free thoughts, their divergent views, and this is why you see more of this coming out in literature and poetry and music, more skepticism, more agnosticism being freely displayed. Is it a little safer now to do that? Is that one reason?
I do think it's a little bit safer. I think along with just sort of modernization, urbanization plays a really significant role in the foundations of Black free thought during this time, because you have individuals who were perhaps the only free thinker in their small rural southern communities, right? Like Eatonville, Florida, or for Zora Neale Hurston, or Joplin, Missouri for Langston Hughes, right? They would have been really isolated there. They wouldn't have necessarily been able to share their non-belief or their skepticism with other people. But once they come together during the Great Migration and they're in Harlem, they're in Chicago, they're in these other cities, now all of a sudden they're around like-minded people who believe or don't believe, as it were, some of the same things. So this just allows for a level of community. It allows for them to discuss their ideas, to debate ideas, to argue with one another in a way that just would not have been possible living in small rural communities.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's so inspiring. I mean, to think about these authors that, that we've known and read, sitting together, having coffee, going to bars and really debating things is such an inspiring thing to think about and to read about, because that just, it's a milieu, right? And it's so much amazing stuff comes out of that context, as you note in your book, and as others have noted, the poetry of Langston Hughes and the novels of Richard Wright, and I guess he comes a little bit later, but just so much amazing music and art from that period that's just so rich. And I think it's cool to see the traces of secularism within that story. And I guess it's a little surprising to me that that's not celebrated more, or maybe it is and I'm unaware of it, in the modern African-American community, where it does still seem like religion tends to dominate things. Is that a fair assessment, or is there a presence of Black secularism that the media just doesn't express or show us?
No, I definitely think that's a fair assessment, because a lot of these people, we read them in junior high school. We read them in high school. Most of my students have read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, right? But they never knew that she was sort of an agnostic at times, a deist at other times, right? They never read any excerpts from her autobiography. They never read her anthropological works or anything like that. That sort of express her free thought. So same thing with Langston Hughes, right? We've all read The Negro Speaks of Rivers, right? At some level in school during Black History Month or something like that. But we haven't necessarily read some of his other poems that express religious skepticism, or the excerpts from his autobiography where he's discussing how he came to be a non-believer. So yeah, a lot of these folks, I'm not really exploring a ton of obscure people, right? These are very well-known thinkers and artists, but they're well-known for their intellectual productions, for their artwork, not necessarily for their religious skepticism. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to sort of contribute with this book, is to just give a different perspective on some of these individuals, and also tie what we do know about them to their irreligiosity.
Yeah. And like anything else, none of these intellectual movements or artistic movements happen in a vacuum. I mean, obviously, it's all in response to context, which is why I love history so much and appreciate, books like this that take this long view of a development through history. And so as you come a little further towards our day, you talk about the Communist Party in the United States and socialism, and the way that many of the Black freethinkers are also part of that movement. And I wonder if you could sort of briefly explain why you think that is. Like, why did people that were already freethinkers in regards to religion sort of also then gravitate towards socialist and communist movements in the United States?
Sure. It's sort of a dialectical influence, I argue. In 1924, the Comintern, the Communist International, put out a directive where they very explicitly said that we expect all communists to be atheists, right? So this is the sort of default religious position of the Communist Party. And so, once people who are already free thinkers, caught wind of that and caught wind of the irreligiosity of the Communist Party, that's something that would have been very attractive to them, right? And many free thinkers were also attracted to the sort of internationalism of the communists, right? They felt that they could sort of express a clear kind of Pan-Africanism. And so both socialists and communists likewise tied imperialism and racism to capitalism. Right. So those critiques and those political positions were very attractive to Black freethinkers. But then it's probably also the case that you had some African Americans who were simply attracted to communism for its economic philosophy and political philosophy, but then later on kind of came around to the religious skepticism of it. So it sort of works both ways, I think, where you have free thinkers who are attracted to them because of their irreligion, but then sort of Black radicals who are attracted to communism and then sort of progress into free thinkers.
And then in the Black Power movement, it evolves, into its own unique expression with the Black Panther Party and others, Huey Newton and so forth, who really took communism, or the ideas, at least the liberatory sort of concepts of socialist and communist politics and economics, and made it so specifically American, but also African American. Did those leaders of like, say, the Black Power movement were also religious skeptics in large part, were they not?
Yes, yeah, they were. Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, David Hilliard, the Minister of Information for the party, a number of rank and file members were all freethinkers. James Forman, one of the basically founders and earliest articulators of Black Power as a political philosophy, was also an atheist and writes very clearly about his atheism influencing his political thought in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. So, the last chapter sort of aims to reposition civil rights and Black Power as an important part of the story of African American secularism, and argues that the Black Panther Party in many ways kind of functioned as a secular movement, and that the organ of the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther newspaper, was at times a free thought publication in giving space to the work of, poets like Yvette Pearson and Sarah Webster Fabio to write poems and other pieces that were highly critical of Christianity and that sort of celebrated the secular humanism of the party.
So it seems, when I talk about, and my colleagues talk about free thought, we're usually thinking about religion. And I suppose that is the primary genesis and use of that expression. But I think in a more broad sense, like a lowercase f free thought, it makes sense that anytime you're challenging the sort of the received tradition, that you are being a freethinker, and so to stand up and say, hey, capitalism is killing us, was a common refrain for Black intellectuals, Black revolutionaries. I mean, they've been saying fill in the blank is killing us forever, right? So to sort of point out the next thing that's killing everyone is probably not that far of a leap for them to say, like, hey, slavery and capitalism are, twins, two sides of the same coin, and Jim Crow and all the rest is it's really of a piece, and it's, I guess, somewhat surprising to me once I've learned this, that it isn't more common. I guess that's true for a lot of the things that I've learned later in life, whether it was critique of religion or politics, that once you see sort of the liberation theme in so much of critique of economics and politics, and how it fits in with religion in the way that Marx said, for example, so, around the same time, that it's not more common, that we don't see more robust critique of these systems of power in our present discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case in general, right? If I go back to the subject of my first book, the abolitionist movement, you would think that this would have been a widespread movement, and we look back on it and expect that, all Northerners or something were abolitionists, but most historians estimate that roughly only 5% of Northerners had any involvement in the anti-slavery movement. Right. Same thing for women's rights. All of these sort of radical movements throughout American history, they've always had very few adherents. So it's just always the case that, usually only have a small slice of people willing to sort of speak up. Right. And then of those people, it's an even smaller percentage that are sort of far left radical. Right. A lot of people are part of social movements, but are, a little more moderate, trying to sort of work within the system. Right.
Yeah, and Ibram Kendi's new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and in thinking about, this idea that it's not enough to be, to not be racist, or to at least work towards not being racist for someone like myself, to saying that's not enough. To be anti-racist is really the calling, for all of us, that especially people like me and my folks, my background, have been part of creating the problem, is really the measure, sort of the standard to shoot for, and how controversial this idea is even today to bring up racism, in certain quarters is, the whole narrative gets flipped on its head, as if those of us that are working against racism are the ones perpetuating racism or something like that. So even now, like, these concepts that you would think would be fairly widely received or widely understood are controversial because I suppose it's because they challenge power. They challenge the systems that are putting, money in the pockets of the majority. Yeah, they challenge power, and they challenge people's sort of fundamental conception of themselves, right? And who they are, right? And saying that, just because you don't believe a certain thing doesn't mean you're not part of the problem, right? And it makes people really sort of look deeply into themselves in a way that they may not want to, or in a way that may be very uncomfortable. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess that sort of brings me to the contemporary moment. And, there are this, you sort of, stop with civil rights. And I mean, obviously every book has to have an ending somewhere. And, but as you're coming out here in a few weeks and speaking at the Black Atheists of Los Angeles. We have Black Nonbelievers, which is a national organization, and even in some respects international. And so the beat goes on, right? Like, there's still Black Freethinkers. There's, like you mentioned, Anthony Pinn a minute ago, one of the leading intellectuals in the Black Free Thought movement today. And incredibly, I mean, if my listeners haven't picked up a book by Anthony Pinn, you've really got to do that. His biography or his autobiography is a great place to begin. And I can put some links in the show notes about that. But so this intellectual, artistic, protest movement, if you will, continues. And I wonder if you see any development. Like, are we getting closer to a clear understanding of Black Americans being a part of the struggle for a free society, like a secular society that is pluralistic and open to everyone? Or are we still sort of like are we still gonna just be fighting that battle forever? Yeah. So the afterword of the book sort of briefly traces a lot of what you've just discussed, and this is actually going to be a subject of a second volume on Black Free Thought after the Civil Rights Movement. I was going to include a chapter at the end of this book, but then I got into the research and I realized there's too much information for one chapter. Oh, right? It would be 100-page chapter, if not more. So I'm just going to write another volume on Black Free Thought after 1975. And that book will show that one of the key developments, or probably the key development in Black Free Thought, has been its institutionalization, right? First with Norm Allen Jr. creating African Americans for Humanism, then groups like Black Atheists of America, and then Black Nonbelievers with Mandisa. All of these organizations are specifically trying to now bring together Black freethinkers in a way that sort of had been done, but had been done for other purposes, right? So the Harlem Renaissance brought together Black freethinkers, but it didn't necessarily do so because of their religion, right? That was, from my perspective, a happy byproduct of the Harlem Renaissance, but it was really an artistic and an intellectual movement. Same thing with the Black Panther Party, right? That brought people together under the guise of a new revolutionary and radical political movement, and many of its adherents happen to be freethinkers. So now we have people specifically targeting folks for their non-belief. And I do think they've made some important strides, right? And I think that they've learned from a lot of the sort of history that I explore in this book.
and they've developed some very useful strategies. So Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, for example, founded by Sikivu Hutchinson. Some of the work that they're doing is actually a lot of what Black churches do, right? So they're raising money for scholarships for kids who would be the first in their family to go to college, right? They're fighting for, affordable housing and advocating for prisoner reentry programs and things that usually churches or social service organizations would take on. And Hutchinson argues in her book Moral Combat, as well as her book Godless Americana, that if Black secularists want to have a broader appeal, then they need to be doing the things that Black churches are doing, right? That many people, they might not necessarily believe in the theology preached at a Black church, but they feel that, it's good for community, but it's also good just materially, right? And helping them find a job and, helping them with, an after school program or something like that. So you are starting to see some of these Black secular organizations kind of come around and adopting some of these methods to appeal to a wider swath of the Black population. And Anthony Pinn notes in one recent history of African American religion that includes non-believers that the percentage of Black nuns has doubled over the past 20 years. Now, some of these individuals maybe are theistic, but just don't necessarily have any institutional affiliation. But it's also the case that many of these people are atheist, agnostic, or some other religious skeptic, right? So we are seeing an increase in the number of Black secularists and a shift in kind of strategies for appealing to the Black population.
Do you think there's anything lost in sort of religious, Black religious skepticism for its own sake? Like you were saying a minute ago that it was sort of a happy coincidence that's like the Harlem Renaissance and Black Power movements were also intersected with religious skepticism. And today we're seeing more religious skepticism as its own cause, as its own standalone issue. And I wonder if that's like sustainable, because then you're talking about Black skeptics, and I apologize, I said Black atheists of Los Angeles earlier. You're absolutely right. It's the Black skeptics of Los Angeles. They're incorporating this social political message with their work and saying essentially that the cause itself is, I guess, and these are my words, not Sikivu's or yours or anybody else's, but like the cause, it seems to me, that attracts people is, I guess, what I would call, liberation. We're trying to be free, and in the process of being free, one of the things that we free ourselves from is superstition that keeps us down. And but I've often wondered where the secular movement goes if non-belief becomes an end in itself.
Yeah, I do think that, really from the early 20th century, probably the signal contribution that Black freethinkers made to the broader American free thought movement is trying to explicitly combine their religious skepticism with their political commitments. And it's sort of a broader turn, I think, in American free thought in the early 20th century with, you start to see some more free thinkers pushing for gender equality, right, and participating in the suffrage movement in the 19-teens, and then Black freethinkers, of course, pushing for racial equality and anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism. These concerns weren't necessarily on the minds of some of the leading white freethinkers of the 19th century.
Right.
And, that it's understandable because many of these people were not themselves experiencing discrimination, right? So for them, we see the same thing among white religious liberals, right? Like Unitarians and whatnot, that for them, freedom of conscience was most important because they were, physically and politically free to do whatever they wanted. Mm-hmm. So this has been a really significant contribution of Black free thought. And, I think a lot of contemporary Black freethinkers, they're forming their own institutions and their own organizations because they believe and because it's the case that in many times mainstream atheist or secular organizations have not been as responsive to social justice efforts. Now that is changing. It's not changed completely. It's a process. But I do think this is something that, historically and in the contemporary period is critically important to Black freethinkers, right? And really, it kind of relates to broader histories of Black and white political thought, right? Even if we go back to the American Revolutionary period, for example, and explore the political ideology of the people who we have records for, we see that even in the 1770s, American leaders and a lot of American lay people and the populace, got their political thought from Hobbes and Locke and all these folks who focused quite a bit on individual freedom and individual liberty. And they believe that you can never have a just democratic society without the guarantee of individual rights. Whereas, at the same period, African-American political thought most often dealt with the collective, right? Mm-hmm. That the individual can never be free unless the collective is free.
Right.
We need to abolish slavery. We need to get rid of racist laws and institutions for the entire group if any one person is going to be free. So that kind of dichotomy developed very early in the nation's political history. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of played itself out in a lot of other arenas of American life, including the free thought movement.
This is exactly, where my head was at as well. And I think the current state of the secular movement in America really reflects the fact that there aren't significant sort of top-level leadership in these institutions that are African-American or people of color. Mm-hmm. And they have formed, as you said, formed their own institutions, which is, I think, a fantastic thing. And it also just reflects what I've seen in other arenas throughout, my lifetime. I was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor up until 6 years ago. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, and I, for a period of time, was a pastor in the Philadelphia area. I was raised on the West Coast, and moving to Philadelphia, it came to my attention, and I don't know how this had escaped my attention earlier, that there were Black conferences and white conferences. And the euphemism was regional conferences because the white conferences were usually states, so Pennsylvania was a conference and New York is a conference. And then there were the Allegheny East Conference was a Black conference that spanned parts of Ohio, parts of Western Pennsylvania, and so forth. So these were so-called regional conferences, and I just couldn't believe it. In fact, when I was applying when I was an undergrad, finishing my senior year, and I was applying for work as a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, I sent my resume out to all the conferences. I sat down with the yearbook and sent letters and resumes to all the conferences, including the Black conferences, because I didn't know that they were. I just was sending letters to every conference. And and I told one of my friends what I had done, and he was like, oh, wow, you probably won't hear back from some of those. And I don't know that they're hiring white pastors. And I didn't even know that there were Black conferences. And so when I got to my church in Bucks County, the nearest two churches to me were Black churches that were not in my conference. So I never saw those pastors at my ministerial meetings because they went to different ministerial meetings. It was so segregated. I just couldn't believe it, and this was sort of an eye-opening experience for me and sort of led me to invest a lot of, a little bit of my time in getting to know those ministers and meeting with them and having them show me the ropes around the city. And I guess I say all that to say that the institutions were still favoring a particular worldview, which was the majority worldview at that time, which was, the white world, and still is. They talk about abolishing the black conferences, and it's, getting rid of that segregated system, but it's never like getting rid of the white conferences, right? It's always getting rid of the black conferences and getting rid of the segregation in that way. And I just see that same kind of thing playing out now in the secular movement, where you have smaller organizations cropping up at the margins to meet a need that's unmet, and the primary, institutions, the larger institutions that have been around for a lot longer, still dominated by white leadership. And it's not, I keep, saying this to various people, whoever will listen, that it's not about it is about representation, but it's not just about making sure you have a person of color on your board or something like that. It's that those ideas that you want represented in your organization won't be represented unless folks are there who have those things on their mind. And we still are so far away from that if you bring up anti-capitalism, or if you bring up other ways in which free thought and skepticism intersects with political ideologies, you basically get shot down.
Yeah.
I gave a talk once that was about dialectical materialism and the way it evolved in Marxist thinking, and the way that as materialists, as people who don't believe in the supernatural, we ought to be, investing our energies in material well-being, and that material well-being has everything to do with politics and economics, and it's just, it just went over like a lead balloon, So anyway, it's a long ramble to say, I just have so much respect for people who are pushing from the margins and, demanding change, as has always been the case. Frederick Douglass famously, that the power concedes nothing without a demand, and there has to be people constantly pushing. So, I really appreciate the work of folks that on the ground, people like Mandisa and Sikivu and what they're doing, and then the people like yourself and Anthony Pinn who are back sort of, working on the intellectual frameworks for it, and reminding people like me who didn't grow up with this part of the history as a part of my history, that I've missed out on a huge portion of my education.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Free thought and skepticism is about getting rid of the erroneous ideas in our lives that do us harm and getting more truth into our thinking. I think works like yours are so invaluable for the Black free thought movement, but more importantly for white people, honestly, to read and understand.
I do think that a lot of white freethinkers are coming around to the critical importance of social justice and political engagement beyond, the traditional separation of church and state, teaching abolition in schools, stuff like that, right? A lot of my speaking engagements that I'm getting are from, the American Humanist Association, and
That's good.
American Atheists is running a feature of the book in their December magazine, and I'm speaking at a bunch of UU churches that are predominantly white. So I think a lot of them are certainly coming around, right, and recognizing the importance and the contributions that Black freethinkers have brought to the movement and can bring in the contemporary era. That's
so encouraging to hear, and I'm so grateful for what you're doing. Before we go, I wanted to ask you a more personal question about how this became the focus of your life and your work. Whether you were raised in a religious household and then, sort of got your way to where you are today, and how you identify today.
Yeah, I wasn't raised in a particularly religious household. My family is French Canadian, so we'd go to midnight mass on Christmas Eve, and maybe we'd go to church on Easter, but that's about it. I actually got more religious in graduate school. So I started attending the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chapel Hill. partly because, I was doing research on African American abolitionists, and of course I knew the history of the AME Church, and I was also I was from New Hampshire. I had moved down to North Carolina. I was looking to connect with people sort of beyond my circle of graduate student friends, and I thought that was a good way to do it, right? So it, like many of the Black freethinkers actually that I explore in the book, it provided a sense of community for me, but I realized very quickly that I did not believe the theology. Right. I was a believer in God when I first started going, but just most of the stuff they were preaching, I just really couldn't get with. So this was back in 2006, 2007. I ended up leaving the AME Church and started attending the Quaker meeting in Chapel Hill, partially also because I had read a lot about Quakers and social justice and all of that. But I also just felt that something that was more sort of reflective and frankly just kind of quieter, where I didn't have to express religion through my body, but really through my mind would be more appropriate for me. But there I felt sort of isolated, really being the youngest person by about 40 years and generally the only African American in attendance. And so I think it was about a year or so later that I started coming across the works of atheist writers like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, who, provided really compelling evidence and really compelling arguments for atheism and for non-belief. So it's probably about 2009 that I became a freethinker, but I didn't start working on the book until I'd say late 2012. Okay. So I was trying to connect with other Black freethinkers online, and I actually earlier in this podcast you had mentioned that you knew a lot of the individual stories and individual people. Well, when I started trying to connect with other folks online on Twitter and Facebook and all that, I started coming across various blog posts and articles about individual Black freethinkers. And, I was already a history professor. I was nearly done my first book, so I was looking for a second book project. And as I started coming across these stories of individual Black freethinkers, I realized there's no kind of overarching history kind of tying all of this together, right? Yeah. We know a little bit about some people, Hubert Harrison, we know about Nella Larson, right? We know about these folks, but there's nothing, that sort of organizes Black free thought into a coherent system of thought that's reflective of the broader context, something that develops over time, right? So for me, this was just a really great confluence of the scholarly and the personal, right? Where I could explore something that I was, incredibly passionate about on a personal level, but that was also vitally significant on an academic level, and that could really give us a different picture of African American religious and intellectual life.
Yeah, I think it's amazing, and it was so urgently needed. In fact, I posted on Instagram yesterday that I was really, or maybe it was 2 days ago, that I was loving your book. And I posted a picture of the cover and said that we would be talking, and I got an incredible response. One person said, I was literally looking for this book. Oh, wow. Not specifically yours, but they were looking for a history of African American secularism and hadn't found anything. And so they were like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was looking for. So I think it does meet a need. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's eminently readable. It has a lot of detailed stories. I found it read quickly. Like it draws you through in the way that good storytelling should. And I think that the stories really come alive. I thought, because I was sort of in a hurry to get through it so I could talk to you today, I thought, well, maybe I'll, skim it a little bit and read sort of like the beginning and the ending of chapters and maybe skip over some of the stories. But I just found myself reading the stories, because I was just drawn into them, and I was like, I can't skip this. This is the meat, right? This is the good stuff, that people like you, historians, right, dig out of, letters and journals and It's not in their main body of, like you said, we read Zora Neale Hurston,
Yep.
Their Eyes Were Watching God, and that's it, right? Like you said earlier, like that's what we know of her. And so thanks to people like you, there's so much more to know about her. And these stories they read like almost like a novel, like being drawn into their lives, and the dynamism of the Harlem Renaissance has always been something that fascinated me. And so thank you, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Of course. Yeah, I appreciate it. And, like I said, it was a pleasure working on this. For my first book and some other projects, there have been parts of it where I was interested in the overall topic, but some of the research did seem a little tedious, and that was not the case with Black Freethinkers, which is why I think I finished it so quickly. Right after I began researching it, it only took me about 2 or 3 years to get a full draft of the book, because I was just so incredibly passionate about it and really wanted to share this with everyone. Yeah,
you can tell. Well, thanks so much for being on the show and for sharing, what you've learned. And I hope everyone will go out and pick up a copy and look forward to your continuing research.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you were inspired and provoked to learn more about this topic, to get his book, and to broaden your understanding of the history of secularism in America. I'd love to hear what you thought. Please write to me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org. Perhaps as you were listening, you thought of someone who you think should hear this. Please share it with them. The single greatest way that people find out about this podcast is from listeners like you who share it with their friends and post it on social media for others to hear. To learn more about Life After God and to link up with all of our social media accounts and stay in touch, please visit our website at lifeaftergod.org. There you can join our email newsletter and browse the back catalog of episodes. If this podcast is meaningful to you and it's been a source of inspiration, please join the group of members and patrons who make it possible by visiting the Patreon page at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. The price of a coffee per month goes so much further than you can imagine and grows the total base of contributors. In this way, more people will take what we're doing seriously, and we will reach a much wider audience. Thank you again for tuning in, and seriously, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, my name is Ryan Bell, and this has been the Life After God podcast.